Hello, friends. I am bringing you our final chapter and ending to our Bookwanderers book. So we're on chapter 39, How the Story Had to End. Matilda, Bea said, choking, her eyes filling with tears. I still can't believe it's really you. Tilly couldn't look at her mother. You didn't recognize me, she whispered. I am so sorry, Bea said, her voice shaking. I was not myself in there. Only a shadow, really. That book, I don't even know what Chalk or your grandparents have told you about it. A bit, Tilly said, glancing nervously at Amelia. It's all right, Tilly, said Amelia. Your mom and I are old friends. I didn't know for certain, but I'd long had my suspicions about who your father is. I know it as a friend, not the librarian, and I will keep it close. I promise you both. Bea grasped Amelia's hand and squeezed it gratefully as she continued her story. Matilda, I promise you that when I first met your father, I didn't mean to fall in love with him. It was a book I had enjoyed as a child. I loved it for the same reasons as you. I was barely aware of your father as a character. I never even book-wandered inside until I was at university, and falling in love was an accident. I knew the rules as well as any book-wanderer when I visited a little princess. I just wanted to meet Sarah, really. The first time that he and Sarah went to the school, I was on the street just watching. But when they left, I was standing too close, and the horse took fright when it saw me and nearly kicked me. Ralph jumped out immediately to make sure I was okay, and everything just snowballed, and I couldn't stop it, even though I knew how the story had to end. I knew I should go back, but I couldn't bear to leave him. It wasn't until I realized I was expecting you that I knew I had to come home. I couldn't risk having you inside the book. The only way to guarantee your safety was for you to be born in the real world. And then, afterward, I was desperate to find a way for us all to be together, but it wasn't possible. I tried to see him. I wanted to tell him about you, but it never worked how I planned it. The horse didn't take fright, or your father didn't notice, or I just wasn't in quite the right place at the right time. And he and Sarah always left without seeing me. In the end, I didn't know what to do. I just wanted you to know your father, and I wanted him to know you. And then, while I was in the underlibrary with your granddad, helping him clear out his office, Chuck took me to one side and, without warning, and told me that he knew of a way that Crew and I could be together in the real world. Chuck knew nothing about you, Tilly, but he did know how desperate I was. Everyone did after the Source Library debacle. He said he could help me if I told him what Dad was doing to stop his plans. Tilly looked confused. What plans? And what was Granddad doing? That's the thing, Tilly, Bea said. I don't think Granddad knows anything about Chalk being fictional, or any plans. He certainly never spoke to me about it. As far as I'm aware, Archie knows nothing about Chalk's true identity, Amelia said quietly. But how do you? Tilly asked. And why did you let him keep working here? I've suspected for a while that something was awry, but I didn't know for certain until tonight, she said. And I wanted him close by while I tried to find evidence and work out what he was trying to achieve. But I think that might be a story for another day. But how did you find out that he's a character from a book? Tilly turned back to Bea. Completely by accident, Bea said. When I came to meet him to find out more about what he was offering, I hadn't told your grandparents where I was going. I couldn't tell them I was trying to find another way for us to be with your father. When I arrived, he wasn't in his office, so I just went in and waited, and absent-mindedly flicked through the book on his desk as I didn't recognize the title. Like mother, like daughter, am I right? Oscar said, but no one laughed. It was stamped as a source edition, Bea continued, so it shouldn't have been in here anyway. There were so many blank pages with only the odd page or paragraph printed here and there. But my eye was caught by the name Enoch Chalk, and as I flicked through, it kept coming up. I hadn't even joined the dots in my own brain when he stalked into the room and saw me reading his book. He started yelling at me, telling me no one could know, that it was a secret. He started ranting about how only a handful of people had noticed anything wrong over the years, and that they had all been dealt with. Then it dawned on me why he was so angry and terrified. I realized it was him in the book. His name being the same wasn't a coincidence, and it wasn't from him having traveled in as a book wanderer. I went for the door, but he wouldn't let me leave, just grabbed my wrist, closed my eyes, and the next thing I knew I was inside a little princess. He let go of me and vanished, and I was stuck, because he hadn't even brought the book with us, let alone left it with me. And I would have been there for who knows how long if you hadn't found me, Matilda. And Oscar, Tilly said quietly. But why didn't you get stuck in the end papers? Oscar asked Bea. Amelia looked at Tilly, Oscar, and Bea and sighed deeply. Chalk seems to have created some sort of loop, and even books that can't be stamped. There's obviously an awful lot more explaining that needs to be done, but I think perhaps the priority right now is to get you all home. She helped Bee out of her chair and wrapped her friend up in a warm hug. Tilly could see tears on both of their cheeks. Tilly and Oscar, if we took a shortcut back to Pages and Company, do you think you could pretend to forget about it? They nodded and followed Amelia, who still had an arm round Bee, out of Chalk's office, back through the main library hall into the map room. Tilly looked at Amelia in confusion. I know I showed you this room before, Tilly, but it has a rather less publicized function, only to be used in emergencies by the most senior and trusted of librarians. They followed Amelia in, and she closed the door behind them. Tilly, if you wouldn't mind, perhaps you could find Pages and Company on the map again? Tilly found the tiny glowing light that marked home and turned expectantly to Amelia. And next, if you could just pop your finger in on that light. Don't worry, it's not hot. Now read the bookshop name. Tilly did as she was asked, but nothing happened. Perfect. Thank you, Tilly. Now, Oscar, would you mind getting the door? The door we just came in through? Oscar said hesitantly. The very same, Amelia said, nodding her head toward it. Oscar went back to the door and opened it. The doorway looked like it had a sheet of tissue paper hanging in front of it. Amelia grinned at Tilly and Oscar. Just between us, remember? She said, and the four of them went through. It was like walking through a waterfall made out of magic. There was a second when their vision was blurred and they couldn't see anything at all, and then they were in the main entrance to Pages and Company, with the party going on as if they had never left. I told you they wouldn't notice we'd gone, Tilly said. I'm glad to see this evening hasn't stopped you being annoying when you're right, Oscar said, but he was smiling. The bookshop was full of people and light and music. Granddad was still behind the till, putting a pile of books in the brown paper bags printed with the Pages and Company logo for a customer holding a cocktail. He glanced up and saw the four of them looking a little shell-shocked in the doorway. When he noticed who was being supported by Amelia, he staggered a little on his feet. He left the customer mid-sentence and walked toward them. Is that you, my little Bee? He said, holding out a hand toward Beatrice. Bee collapsed into his arms, and they held on to each other for a very long time. I'll go and find your grandma, Amelia said, and soon Elsie joined her husband and daughter and pulled Tilly in. Amelia put an arm round Oscar's shoulder. Well done, she said. I don't know all the details, but I do know that Tilly couldn't have done this without you. Hours later, after all the guests had gone home, Granddad, Grandma, Bee, Tilly, Amelia, and Oscar were sitting on a blanket round a circle of candles and leftover cake. Tilly didn't quite know how to be around the mum she'd never known, but simply being next to her was a start, and every time Bee smiled at her, she felt one of the tiny cracks in her heart start to knit back together, even if the edges were still a little messy. Tilly and Oscar, mouths full of cake, explained exactly what had happened that evening, with Bee adding how she had discovered Chalk's secret and Amelia filling in any other gaps. When she said that Chalk had escaped, Granddad gave a shudder. Do we have any idea where he's gone? I know you're more than capable of dealing with this, Amelia, but a source character on the loose who seems determined to bend the rules of book wandering to his own aims is a rather unprecedented turn of events, even for the underlibrary. We've got some educated guesses about where to begin, Amelia said. I've asked some colleagues to seal off his office, and we're going to start with the very small supply of books in there, and any books we know he has a historic link to. The rules of book wandering are being stretched and tested in a way they haven't been before, maybe even beyond Chalk's meddling. You must let me know if I or Elsie or Tilly and Oscar can be of any help, said Granddad, and to one side Oscar choked a little on a mouthful of cake when he heard his name. I will, of course, Archie. We'll find him and deal with him, Amelia said, and Granddad nodded. He may be a source character, but they still have their limits. But, Tilly, I have one more question. How did you get back to the underlibrary again without any of the librarians noticing? Did you use the damaged copy of A Little Princess? Tilly shook her head fiercely. No, you said not to. We sort of went via the end papers of Alice in Wonderland, Tilly confessed sheepishly. I sort of put everything together. What Seb told us, and what happened when I ended up back at the underlibrary when the last lines were missing from A Little Princess, and realized that I could travel from the end papers because of who my father is, and the whole being half-fictional thing. So we just traveled to the very end of the book and waited, and everything went all trippy and weird and sort of rewound around us, Oscar finished. That was incredibly risky, Amelia said, pale-faced. I'm sure Seb warned you that the end papers are a dangerous place. But ingenious, you have to admit, Grandma said, failing to keep a distinct note of pride from her voice. Amelia tutted, but with the hint of a smile on her face. Honestly, Elsie. Speaking of the end of Alice, Tilly said, trying to change the subject a little, why does Alice's story end with the whole thing being a dream? Well, Granddad said, I've always thought that it's because the writer is saying that our dreams and our stories matter. I think it's quite beautiful that you can read the whole book as Alice telling her sister a story, and then Alice's sister is thinking about passing on the story to their future children, because stories last much longer than we do. Our stories are how we will be remembered, so we've got to make sure they're worth telling. Epilogue. I think it's time, Bee said to Tilly, who nodded. It was a frosty weekend at the start of December, and every day since she had come home, Bee and Tilly had got to know each other a little better than they had the day before. Their relationship was still fragile, but it was beautiful and sweet like spun sugar. Tilly got out her brand new copy of A Little Princess and turned to the page where Captain Crewe and Sarah first arrive at Miss Minchin's. The moment Bee had first met Captain Crewe, and the moment Tilly had first seen her father. They held hands and Tilly read them in. Even as the smoggy Victorian square blossomed around them, they did not drop each other's hands. They watched as the black cab drew up to the school steps and a small girl with a black bob got out, clutching the hand of a tall man. The two characters climbed the steps to the school and rang the doorbell. As the door opened, Captain Crewe happened to glance behind him to where Bee and Tilly were standing. He tilted his head as if he recognized them but couldn't place from where, and then offered them a smile and a tip of his hat before disappearing inside. Bee pulled Tilly closer to her as she wiped a tear from her cheek. She took a deep breath and smiled, and Tilly read them back to Pages and Company, where Granddad had the kettle on. And that's the end. There is another book in the Bookwanderers series. Book 2 is called The Lost Fairy Tales. So you can look for book 2 if you want to hear more about Tilly and what happens with her. Have a good afternoon, friends.